the Advent Wreath Arsonist. Welcome, dear listeners, to Velvet Clues, and I am Connor, your narrator for tonight's tale of mystery and murder in the peaceful village of St. Mary Mead. Before we begin, I wonder if you've ever considered how the most sacred traditions can sometimes mask the darkest intentions. Tonight's story takes place during Advent, that holy season of waiting and anticipation, when candles are lit to mark the approaching celebration of light entering the world. But as Miss Jane Marple would discover, sometimes those flames illuminate more than just our prayers. Chapter 1. The Third Sunday's Pink Candle. The morning service at St. Mary Mead's ancient church had concluded with its usual gentle rustling of hymn books and murmured farewells. Miss Marple, adjusting her hat as she prepared to depart, observed with interest the careful way Mr. Gerald Whitfield cradled his newly blessed Advent wreath. The church treasurer of 20 years moved through the congregation with the measured dignity of someone carrying precious cargo, which indeed he was. The wreath itself was a magnificent creation, its evergreen boughs woven with purple ribbon and adorned with 4 candles, 3 purple and 1 pink for this third Sunday of Advent, traditionally known as Gaudete Sunday, the Sunday of rejoicing. "Beautiful arrangement this year, Gerald," commented Colonel Bantry as he passed. "Though I dare say you've outdone yourself with those candles. Austrian import, are they?" Mr. Whitfield's thin face creased in a pleased smile. "Indeed, Colonel. Special order from Vienna. The wax burns with exceptional clarity, I'm told. One must maintain certain standards, particularly when serving as an example to the parish." Miss Marple watched this exchange with her characteristic attentiveness, noting how Whitfield's fingers continuously adjusted the wreath's position, ensuring the candles remained perfectly vertical. She had known Gerald Whitfield for the better part of 2 decades, observing his transformation from eager young accountant to pillar of the church community. His dedication to maintaining the church's finances had been exemplary, though she had noticed of late a certain tension in his manner, a tightness around the eyes that spoke of worries carefully concealed. The church organ wheezed its closing voluntary, a sound that made several parishioners wince. The magnificent instrument, dating from 1680, had been silent for 3 years now, its voice reduced to this wheezing harmonium that Miss Caroline Hartley, the church organist, played with visible distress. Each Sunday, the congregation endured the inadequate substitute, reminded of the ongoing restoration fund that had yet to produce any visible results. "Patience, Miss Hartley," Whitfield called out, as the organist emerged from behind her instrument, her face flushed with the effort of coaxing music from the failing harmonium. "The Restoration Committee meets again next week, I assure you. Progress is being made." Miss Hartley's response was a tight smile that didn't reach her eyes. She had been the church organist for 40 years, inheriting the position from her father, and the deterioration of the historic organ seemed to age her more with each passing Sunday. Miss Marple noticed how the organist's gaze followed Whitfield as he departed with his wreath, an expression of something deeper than mere frustration crossing her weathered features. As the congregation dispersed into the crisp December afternoon, Miss Marple lingered in the churchyard, ostensibly admiring the Advent decorations, but actually observing the various interactions among the parishioners. She noticed young Timothy Webb, the verger's son, helping to clear the altar while casting nervous glances toward Mr. Whitfield's retreating figure. She observed Mrs. Pemberton, the flower arranger, whispering urgently to her husband while gesturing toward the church doors. And she particularly noted how Miss Hartley stood alone by the lich gate, watching Whitfield's departure with an intensity that seemed quite at odds with the peaceful sanctity of the day. The afternoon light was already beginning to fade as Miss Marple made her way home, the winter darkness approaching with its customary swiftness. She knew that throughout the village, families would be gathering for the traditional Sunday evening lighting of their Advent wreaths, that gentle ritual of anticipation that marked the season. Mr. Whitfield, she knew, was particularly punctual about this observance, lighting his candles at precisely 6 o'clock each Sunday evening, a habit he'd maintained for as long as anyone could remember. As she settled into her favourite chair with her knitting, Miss Marple found herself thinking about the morning's observations, about the tensions that seemed to simmer beneath the surface of the peaceful Advent service. There was something in the air, she thought, something that made her usually steady hands pause in their work. The pink candle of Gaudete Sunday was meant to symbolize joy breaking through the penitential purple of Advent's waiting, but Miss Marple, with her long experience of human nature, sensed that this particular Sunday's joy might prove tragically short-lived. Chapter 2. Flames visible from the village green. The evening had settled over St. Mary Mead with the peculiar stillness that often precedes dramatic events, though none could have predicted the horror that would soon shatter the Advent peace. Miss Marple had just finished her modest supper of poached fish and was settling in with her knitting when the first cry of alarm pierced the winter darkness. Through her sitting-room window she could see an ominous orange glow rising from the direction of Church Lane, where Gerald Whitfield's cottage stood in its neat garden. Within moments the village fire bell was clanging its urgent summons, and Miss Marple could hear the rush of feet on pavement as neighbours hurried toward the source of the conflagration. She quickly donned her coat and hat, knowing that her presence might be required, if not for assistance, then certainly for observation. As she approached Church Lane, the full horror of the scene became apparent. Whitfield's cottage was engulfed in flames that seemed to leap with unusual ferocity from every window, casting dancing shadows across the faces of the gathering crowd. "Stand back, everyone!" shouted Jim Cricket, captain of the village fire brigade, as his men struggled to connect their hoses to the nearest hydrant. "This is burning far too hot for a normal house fire." Miss Marple positioned herself near Mrs. Pemberton, who stood wringing her hands as she watched the flames consume the cottage's thatched roof. "I was just closing my curtains," Mrs. Pemberton gasped, "when I saw the first flames through Mr. Whitfield's front window. It spread so quickly, like nothing I've ever seen. The whole sitting room seemed to explode into fire all at once." The heat from the blaze was intense even from across the street, and Miss Marple noted how the firefighters were forced to approach from angles, unable to directly confront the inferno that raged within the cottage's walls. Through the shattered front window, she could glimpse the interior of what had been Whitfield's sitting room, now transformed into a hellish scene of destruction. And there, just visible through the smoke and flames, she could make out a dark shape that her experienced eye recognized with grim certainty as human remains. Dr. Haydock arrived within minutes, his medical bag in hand, though it was clear his services would not be required for the living. He stood beside Miss Marple, his usually cheerful face grave as he surveyed the scene. "Poor Whitfield," he murmured. "To think we were just speaking this morning after church. He was so pleased with his Advent wreath, said he was looking forward to his evening devotions." "His Advent wreath," Miss Marple repeated thoughtfully, her sharp eyes studying the pattern of the flames. "Tell me, Doctor, do you notice anything unusual about how this fire is burning?" Dr. Haydock frowned, considering the question. "Now that you mention it, yes. The intensity is remarkable, and the colour of the flames, there's an almost white quality to them in places. That's not typical of a wood and fabric fire." Inspector Slack arrived with his usual bustle of authority, immediately establishing a perimeter and beginning to question witnesses. Miss Marple remained in the background, observing as the fire brigade finally began to bring the blaze under control. It took nearly 2 hours before the flames were sufficiently subdued to allow entry into what remained of the cottage. The interior presented a scene of devastating destruction. The sitting room, where Whitfield had clearly been when the fire began, was charred beyond recognition. Yet even in this ruin, certain details stood out to Miss Marple's trained eye. The remains of what had clearly been an Advent wreath lay scattered near the body, its metal frame twisted by the intense heat. More significantly, the burn patterns on the floor and walls suggested that the fire had originated from multiple points simultaneously, all radiating from where the wreath had been positioned. Inspector Slack emerged from his initial examination with a grim expression. "The body is definitely Whitfield's," he announced to Dr. Haydock. "His pocket watch survived, engraved with his initials. Time of death appears to coincide with the start of the fire, around 6:30 this evening." 6:30, Miss Marple mused. "Mr. Whitfield always lit his Advent candles at 6 o'clock precisely. That would mean the fire started approximately 30 minutes after the candles were lit." Slack turned to her with his characteristic mixture of irritation and reluctant respect. "And what makes you think the Advent wreath has anything to do with this, Miss Marple?" "Observe the burn patterns, Inspector," she replied calmly. "They radiate from where the wreath was positioned, and note the unusual intensity of the fire, far beyond what one would expect from simple candle flames. I believe you'll find that this was no accident." As the crowd began to disperse and the investigators commenced their grim work, Miss Marple noticed a figure standing apart from the others. Miss Caroline Hartley stood perfectly still at the edge of the light, cast by the dying flames, her face expressionless as she watched the smoke rise into the winter sky. When she finally turned to leave, Miss Marple caught a glimpse of her expression, and what she saw there was not shock or sorrow, but something far more troubling, a look of profound satisfaction quickly masked behind appropriate solemnity. The pink candle of Gaudete Sunday had indeed brought light to St. Mary Mead, but it was the terrible light of destruction rather than joy, and Miss Marple knew with certainty that this fire had been deliberately set. Chapter 3. Phosphorus in the Sacred Wax. The following morning brought Chief Fire Inspector Robinson to St. Mary Mead, his arrival marking the official transformation of the tragedy from accident to criminal investigation. Miss Marple observed his methodical examination of the cottage ruins from her vantage point near the garden gate, where she stood ostensibly discussing the shocking events with Mrs. Price Ridley, though her attention was firmly focused on the investigators' discoveries. Most unusual indeed," Inspector Robinson muttered, as he emerged from the blackened shell of the sitting room, holding several evidence bags containing twisted metal and melted wax fragments. He approached Inspector Slack with an expression of professional bewilderment, mixed with certainty. "I've investigated hundreds of fires, Inspector, but this one presents unique characteristics that point to deliberate arson of a particularly ingenious variety." Inspector Slack gestured impatiently. "Get to the point, man. Was it murder or not?" "Oh, it was murder, all right," Robinson replied, holding up one of the evidence bags. "These candle remnants tell a damning story. Someone hollowed out the Advent candles and filled them with a mixture of paraffin wax and white phosphorus. When the candles burned down to the phosphorus core, approximately 30 minutes into their burning time, they would have erupted into an inferno of incredible intensity." Miss Marple moved closer, her aged features reflecting both interest and sadness. "White phosphorus," she said quietly. "That would explain the unusual white flames Dr. Haydock observed, and the rapid spread of the fire." Robinson nodded grimly. "Precisely, madam. White phosphorus ignites at relatively low temperatures and burns at over 5,000 degrees Fahrenheit. Once it made contact with the regular candle flame, it would have created an explosive reaction. The poor man wouldn't have had a chance to escape. The entire room would have been engulfed within seconds." "But how could someone obtain white phosphorus?" Slack demanded. "It's not exactly a common household item." "It has industrial uses," Robinson explained, "and can be found in certain types of old rodent poisons, fireworks, and even some fertilizers. Someone with chemical knowledge could extract and prepare it. The killer clearly understood both chemistry and timing." Miss Marple considered this information thoughtfully. "The timing is particularly significant, Inspector. Mr. Whitfield was known throughout the village for his punctuality. Everyone knew he would light his Advent candles at precisely 6 o'clock. The killer could establish an alibi for 6:30, knowing the phosphorus would ignite approximately 30 minutes after the candles were lit." Inspector Slack pulled out his notebook. "That means we need to determine who had access to Whitfield's Advent wreath between the church service and 6 o'clock yesterday evening. Miss Marple, you were at the morning service. Did you notice anything unusual about the wreath?" "It appeared perfectly normal during the service," Miss Marple replied. "Mr. Whitfield was quite proud of it, mentioning that the candles were special imports from Austria. The substitution must have occurred afterward." Dr. Haydock, who had arrived to formally identify the body, joined their discussion. "Whitfield lived alone since his wife passed 5 years ago. His housekeeper, Mrs. Barnes, only comes in 3 days a week, and Sunday isn't one of them. Anyone who knew his habits could have entered the cottage during the afternoon." "We found no signs of forced entry," Slack noted. "Either Whitfield let his killer in, or they had a key." Miss Marple's mind was working through the implications. "Inspector, I think you should investigate Mr. Whitfield's role as church treasurer. He's been managing the Organ Restoration Fund for 3 years now, and despite substantial donations, no work has commenced. Several parishioners have expressed concerns about the delays. Slack's eyes sharpened. You're suggesting financial impropriety? I'm suggesting, Miss Marple said carefully, that someone who would commit such an elaborate murder might have a very specific motive. The method chosen, using the Advent wreath itself as the weapon, seems almost symbolic. This wasn't just murder, Inspector. It was a statement. Robinson had been examining more evidence from the scene. There's something else, he announced. We found traces of a specific type of binding agent mixed with the phosphorus, something to make it more stable and predictable in its ignition timing. This isn't amateur work. The killer had significant knowledge of chemistry. Or access to someone who did, Miss Marple suggested. Inspector, I believe you should speak with Miss Caroline Hartley, the church organist. She was most distressed about the organ restoration delays and had recently confronted Mr. Whitfield about the fund's management. Slack looked sceptical. Miss Hartley? She must be 70 years old, hardly the type to concoct elaborate phosphorus bombs. Age, Inspector, does not preclude either intelligence or determination, Miss Marple replied mildly. And Miss Hartley's father was a chemist before he became the church organist. She grew up surrounded by both music and chemistry texts. The combination of knowledge and motive can be found in the most unexpected places. As the investigators continued their grim work, Miss Marple noticed activity at the church. Several members of the Restoration Committee had gathered, no doubt to discuss both the tragedy and its implications for the fund Whitfield had managed. Among them, she could see Miss Hartley, dressed in black and standing slightly apart from the others. Even from a distance, Miss Marple could sense the tension in her bearing, the careful control of someone holding tremendous secrets. The phosphorus in the sacred wax had done its terrible work, transforming a symbol of holy anticipation into an instrument of death. But Miss Marple knew that the real fire had been burning long before yesterday evening, a slow flame of resentment and betrayal that had finally found its explosive expression in the most unlikely of weapons. Chapter 4. The Treasurer's Custom at 6 o'clock. Inspector Slack had established his temporary headquarters in the church vestry, transforming the normally peaceful space into a centre of investigation. Miss Marple sat quietly in the corner, having been reluctantly invited to observe the interviews due to her intimate knowledge of the village and its inhabitants. The inspector was currently questioning Mrs. Barnes, Whitfield's housekeeper, whose red-rimmed eyes suggested genuine grief for her employer. Mr. Whitfield was a creature of habit, Inspector, Mrs. Barnes explained, dabbing at her eyes with a handkerchief. 20 years I've worked for him, and his routines never varied. Sunday evenings were sacred to him. After church, he'd have his lunch at the Crown, return home by 2 o'clock, and spend the afternoon in his study reviewing the church accounts. At 5:30, he'd have his tea, and at 6 o'clock sharp, he'd light his Advent candles in the sitting room. Did anyone visit him yesterday afternoon? Slack asked. Mrs. Barnes shook her head. I wouldn't know, sir, as I wasn't there. But Mr. Whitfield didn't encourage Sunday callers. He valued his quiet afternoons. Though, she paused considering, he did mention on Friday that someone from the Restoration Committee might stop by to collect some documents. Miss Marple leaned forward slightly. Did he say which member of the committee? No, Miss Marple. He just said he'd leave the papers on the hall table if he had to go out. He was always very careful about the church documents, keeping them in his fireproof safe most of the time. After Mrs. Barnes was dismissed, Slack turned to his notes. We need to trace Whitfield's movements yesterday afternoon and determine who had opportunity to tamper with those candles. The next witness was Mr. Timothy Webb, the young verger who had helped clear the altar that morning. The young man entered nervously, his hands twisting his cap as he sat down. Miss Marple had noticed his anxious glances toward Whitfield during the service, and was curious about what he might reveal. Mr. Webb, Slack began, you seemed troubled during yesterday's service. Did you have concerns about Mr. Whitfield? Timothy shifted uncomfortably. It's not my place to speak ill of the dead, Inspector. Murder makes it everyone's place, Slack replied firmly. What did you know? The young man took a deep breath. I've been helping my father with the church maintenance, and we've seen the invoices Mr. Whitfield submitted for the organ restoration. Some of them seem questionable. Companies that didn't appear in any trade directories. Surveys that never seemed to happen despite being paid for. Father wanted to raise it with the bishop, but Mr. Whitfield was so respected we didn't know how to proceed. Miss Marple observed how Timothy's revelation caused Slack to sit up straighter. Are you suggesting Whitfield was embezzling from the Restoration Fund? I don't know what else to call it, sir. There's near £15,000 in that fund, or should be. But when Miss Hartley asked to see the accounts last month, Mr. Whitfield became quite agitated. Said she had no authority to question his management. The picture was becoming clearer, and Miss Marple could see how the threads were weaving together. The next witness confirmed her suspicions even further. Mr. James Morrison, the bank manager, arrived with a ledger under his arm and a troubled expression on his normally cheerful face. Inspector, I've reviewed Mr. Whitfield's personal accounts as you requested, Morrison began. There are significant irregularities. Large cash. Deposits followed by immediate withdrawals. Transfers to bookmaking establishments. Payments to settle what appear to be gambling debts. The patterns go back several years. Gambling debts, Slack repeated. How much are we talking about? Over the past 3 years, approximately £12,000 has moved through his personal accounts in ways that suggest serious gambling problems. The timing of these deposits correlates suspiciously with withdrawals from the Church Restoration Fund account. Miss Marple spoke quietly. So, Mr. Whitfield was using the organ fund to cover his gambling losses, creating false invoices to explain the missing money. But someone discovered his deception. Miss Hartley, Slack said immediately. She had both motive and, as you suggested, possible means. We need to bring her in. But when Constable Polk was sent to fetch Miss Hartley, he returned with surprising news. She's at the church, Inspector, playing the harmonium. Says she won't leave until she's finished Bach's Advent chorales. Been there since 8 this morning, according to several witnesses. The party relocated to the church, where the wheezing notes of the inadequate harmonium filled the ancient space. Miss Hartley played with fierce concentration, her fingers flying over the keys as if trying to force the inferior instrument to produce the glorious sounds that should have emanated from the silenced organ. When she finally stopped, she turned to face them with remarkable composure. I suppose you've come about Gerald Whitfield, she said calmly. I've been expecting you. Miss Hartley, Slack began formally, we need to ask you about your interactions with Mr. Whitfield regarding the Organ Restoration Fund. She laughed bitterly. Interactions? Is that what you call it when you discover someone has stolen money meant to preserve 3 centuries of musical heritage? When my mother died, she left £3,000 specifically for the organ restoration. I watched that money disappear into Gerald's surveys and preparatory work while our magnificent organ rotted into silence. When did you realise what he was doing? Miss Marple asked gently. 6 weeks ago, I demanded to see the complete accounts, and when he refused, I did my own investigation. The companies he claimed to have hired didn't exist. The surveys were fabrications. He killed our organ as surely as if he'd taken an axe to it, all to feed his gambling addiction. The passion in her voice was undeniable, as was the depth of her anger. Yet she sat perfectly still, her hands folded in her lap, the picture of controlled fury. Inspector Slack was about to speak when Miss Marple raised her hand slightly. Miss Hartley, she said, where were you yesterday evening at 6:30? The organist smiled slightly. Where I am every Sunday evening at that time, Miss Marple. Here, practising for the next Sunday service. The vicar saw me, as did Mrs. Pemberton when she came to arrange. Flowers for the weekday services. I was here from 5 o'clock until nearly 9. An alibi, perfectly established. Yet Miss Marple noticed something in Miss Hartley's expression, a glimmer of satisfaction that suggested she knew more than she was revealing. Chapter 5. 3 years of magnificent silence. The investigation had reached a crucial juncture, and Miss Marple found herself standing in the church, gazing up at the magnificent organ that had stood silent for 3 long years. The afternoon light filtered through stained glass windows, casting coloured shadows across the dusty pipes that should have been singing hymns of praise. Inspector Slack stood beside her, having just finished examining the Restoration Fund's financial records with increasing frustration and disgust. £12,000, he muttered. £12,000 stolen from a fund meant to preserve this instrument. The actual estimate for restoration was only 8,000, They could have completed the work and had money to spare. Miss Marple ran her hand along the carved wooden panel that decorated the organ loft. This organ has been the voice of St. Mary Mead for over 3 centuries, Inspector. Generations of organists have sat at that bench, including Miss Hartley's father and grandfather before her. To her, this isn't merely an instrument, it's a living piece of history, a sacred trust. Dr. Haydock entered the church bringing news from his examination. Inspector, I've completed the autopsy. Whitfield died from smoke inhalation, but there are traces of phosphorus in his lungs. He was alive when the fire started, but would have been overcome within moments. The concentration of toxic fumes would have been overwhelming. A mercy, perhaps, Miss Marple observed, though I doubt his killer intended mercy. The vicar, Reverend Clement, joined them, his usually cheerful face drawn with worry. Inspector, I've been reviewing our records as you requested. The organ fund was established 3 years ago when the organ first showed signs of serious deterioration. We had tremendous support from the community. Mrs. Hartley's bequest, Colonel Bantry's contribution, numerous smaller donations from parishioners who remembered the organ's glory days. Tell me about the Restoration Committee, Slack requested. There were 5 members, Clement explained. Myself as chairman, Whitfield as treasurer, Miss Hartley representing the musical interests, Mrs. Price Ridley for the Historical Society, and Mr. Morrison from the bank. We met monthly, though for the past year, Whitfield always had reasons why the work couldn't proceed. Complications with permits, difficulties finding appropriate craftsmen, structural surveys that revealed additional problems. Miss Marple had moved to the organ bench, where sheets of music lay scattered. She noticed they were heavily annotated in Miss Hartley's precise handwriting, adaptations to make pieces written for the full organ playable on the inadequate harmonium. The effort involved in these transcriptions spoke to a dedication that bordered on obsession. Reverend, she asked, when did Miss Hartley first express concerns about the fund's management? About 2 months ago. She'd become increasingly frustrated with the delays and demanded a full accounting. Whitfield was evasive, claimed the paperwork was being audited. They had quite a heated exchange after one committee meeting. Miss Hartley accused him of negligence, and he responded that she had no understanding of financial complexities. Inspector Slack was examining a memorial plaque on the wall. Says here that Miss Hartley's father served as organist for 42 years, and his father for 38 years before that. That's over a century of family service to this church. Indeed, the vicar confirmed. Caroline took over when her father died in 1983. She was just 30 then, already an accomplished musician. She could have had a career in London or Manchester, but she chose to stay here, to maintain the family tradition. This organ was her life's work. A commotion at the church door interrupted their discussion. Constable Polk entered with P.C. Henderson, who was carrying several evidence bags. Inspector, we've searched Miss Hartley's cottage as you requested. We found these in her workshop. The bags contained candle-making supplies, including moulds, wicks, and various types of wax. More significantly, there were several chemistry texts, old volumes that had apparently belonged to her father. One was open to a section on combustible materials, with handwritten notes in the margins. There's more, sir, Henderson continued. We found a partially completed Advent wreath in her workshop. The candles match the design of those that killed Whitfield, and there are traces of some kind of chemical residue on the workbench. Slack's expression was grim. That's enough for an arrest. Where is Miss Hartley now? At home, sir. She returned there after you questioned her this morning. Miss Marple studied the evidence with a thoughtful expression. Inspector, might I suggest we examine these chemistry books more carefully? The handwriting in the margins appears to be quite old, possibly predating recent events. Slack was impatient. Does it matter when she made the notes if she used the knowledge to commit murder? It might matter a great deal, Miss Marple replied. Understanding when and why someone acquires knowledge can be as important as the knowledge itself. The vicar had been silent during this exchange, but now spoke with obvious distress. Surely you can't believe Caroline capable of murder. Yes, she was angry about the organ, but she's devoted her life to this church, to serving God through music. Even the devoted can be driven to extremity, Miss Marple observed sadly. When something we love is destroyed through another's greed, when years of patient service are betrayed, when the very thing that gives life, meaning is allowed to rot into silence, even the most faithful heart can turn to darkness. Dr. Haydock had been examining the chemistry texts. These marginal notes are definitely old, probably made by Caroline's father. He was a chemist before he became the church organist, ran the local pharmacy for years. But look here, he pointed to a specific page. There are fresh pencil marks beside the section on white phosphorus, and these calculations for timing and temperature are recent. The evidence was mounting inexorably. The chemistry knowledge, the candle-making supplies, the matching Advent wreath, all pointed to Miss Hartley as the architect of Whitfield's fiery death. Yet Miss Marple continued to study the music on the organ bench, noting the desperate adaptations, the frustrated attempts to make the wheezing harmonium produce sounds worthy of the liturgy. 3 years, she murmured, 3 years of watching this magnificent instrument die, while the man responsible for its restoration gambled away the funds meant to save it. 3 years of playing an inadequate substitute, while knowing that money donated specifically for the organ was being stolen. How that must have tortured someone who had dedicated their entire life to church music. Inspector Slack was already heading for the door. We need to arrest Miss Hartley before she has a chance to destroy any more evidence. As they prepared to leave, Miss Marple cast one last look at the silent organ. In the coloured light from the windows, the pipes seemed to glow with an inner fire, as if the instrument itself was crying out for justice, for restoration, for the music that had been stolen from it as surely as Whitfield had stolen the money, meant to repair it. Chapter 6. The ledger's missing 15,000. The arrest of Miss Caroline Hartley took place with a dignity that impressed even the cynical Inspector Slack. She answered her door already dressed in her best black suit, a small valise packed and waiting in the hallway, as if she had been expecting this moment. She submitted to the handcuffs without protest, merely requesting that someone ensure her cat was fed and that her music was returned to the church where it belonged. At the police station, Miss Marple was permitted to observe the formal questioning, seated quietly in the corner while Inspector Slack conducted the interrogation. The evidence had been laid out on the table between them, the chemistry texts, the candle-making supplies, the calculations for phosphorus combustion, and most damningly, the financial records that revealed the full extent of Whitfield's embezzlement. The forensic accountant's preliminary report, Slack began, sliding a document across the table, shows that Gerald Whitfield systematically stole £14,732 from the Organ Restoration Fund over the past 3 years. Would you care to comment on that, Miss Hartley? The elderly organist studied the figures with the same intense concentration she might have given to a challenging piece of music. 14,732, she repeated slowly. My mother's £3,000 is in that figure. Colonel Bantry's 5,000. Mrs. Weatherby's 500, saved penny by penny from her pension, all stolen to pay gambling debts. When did you discover the theft? Slack asked. 6 weeks ago, though I had suspected for much longer. The excuses became increasingly elaborate, the delays more preposterous. When I finally confronted him with my suspicions, he laughed. Actually laughed. Said I was a foolish old woman who understood nothing about financial matters. Miss Marple leaned forward slightly. But you did understand, didn't you? Your father ran a pharmacy. You helped with his books for years. Miss Hartley's composure cracked slightly. Father taught me to be meticulous with accounts. Every penny in, every penny out, all properly documented. When I saw Whitfield's records, the fabrications were obvious. Invoices from companies that didn't exist, surveys that never happened, estimates for work never undertaken. So, you decided to kill him, Slack stated bluntly. There was a long silence. Miss Hartley's hands, those talented hands that had played Bach and Handel for 40 years, lay perfectly still on the table. When she finally spoke, her voice was steady. Inspector, have you ever watched something you love die slowly? Not a person, but something that represents centuries of human achievement, countless hours of devotion, the very soul of a community's worship. That doesn't justify murder, Slack replied. No, she agreed. It doesn't, but perhaps it explains it. She paused, seeming to gather her thoughts. That organ was built in 1680 by Christopher Schreider, one of the finest organ builders of his age. It survived the Civil War, the Reformation, 2 World Wars. It sang for coronations and mournings, for 340 years of Christmases and Easters, and Gerald Whitfield killed it for gambling money. She looked directly at Miss Marple then, and something passed between the two elderly women, an understanding that transcended words. "You know, don't you, Miss Marple? You've already worked it out." Miss Marple nodded slowly. The Advent wreath was symbolic, wasn't it? Advent is about waiting, about patient anticipation. You waited and waited for justice, for restoration, for someone to stop Whitfield's theft. But no one did. "I went to the bishop," Miss Hartley continued. "He said he needed more evidence. I went to the police 6 weeks ago. They said it was a civil matter. I even consulted a solicitor, who informed me that recovering the money through legal channels would take years and cost thousands we didn't have. Meanwhile, the organ continued to deteriorate. Another winter, the organ builder said, and the damage would be irreversible." Inspector Slack pushed the evidence bags forward. "So, you decided to take justice into your own hands. You used your father's chemistry knowledge to create phosphorus-filled candles." "My father would have been heartbroken," Miss Hartley said quietly. "He loved that organ almost as much as he loved my mother. Every Sunday of my childhood I sat beside him on the organ bench, learning not just music but reverence for the instrument itself. It was a sacred trust, passed from generation to generation." "Tell us exactly what you did," Slack demanded. Miss Hartley straightened in her chair. "I studied father's chemistry books. White phosphorus seemed appropriate. It burns with a pure, intense flame. I practiced with ordinary candles first, learning how to hollow them out and refill them without detection. The phosphorus was extracted from old rat poison I found in father's workshop. He never threw anything away." "And the timing?" "I knew Whitfield's habits perfectly. Everyone did. 6 o'clock precisely he would light his Advent candles. The phosphorus core was positioned to ignite after approximately 30 minutes of burning. By then, I would be at the church playing the harmonium as I did every Sunday evening, with multiple witnesses to confirm my presence." The confession continued with clinical precision. She described how she had exchanged Whitfield's original Advent candles for her modified ones during the afternoon, when she knew he would be at his lunch. She had a key to his cottage. He had given it to her years ago when she helped nurse his late wife through her final illness, and he had never asked for it back. "I felt nothing as I made the switch," she said. "My hands were perfectly steady, steadier than they'd been in months. I knew what would happen. I knew he would die, and I felt only a sense of rightness, of balance being restored." Dr. Haydock, who had been called to provide medical context, spoke up. The phosphorus would have created toxic fumes almost immediately. Whitfield would have been overcome within seconds. It was relatively quick. "I didn't want him to suffer unnecessarily," Miss Hartley said. "I'm not a sadist, Inspector. I'm a musician who watched a thief destroy the instrument that was my life's work, my family's legacy, my offering to God." Miss Marple had been silent for some time, but now she spoke. "There's something else, isn't there? Something beyond the money and the organ?" Miss Hartley's composed facade finally crumbled. Tears ran down her weathered cheeks as she struggled to speak. 2 weeks ago, the organ builder came for a final assessment. He said the organ was beyond saving now. The pipes were corroding, the bellows had completely failed, the wooden components were riddled with woodworm that had spread due to lack of maintenance. Even with unlimited funds, restoration was no longer possible. We would need an entirely new organ. The weight of this revelation settled over the room. The murder had been not for hope of restoration, but for revenge, for the complete and irreversible destruction of something irreplaceable. Chapter 7. The Organist's Mother's Bequest. The morning following Miss Hartley's confession, Miss Marple found herself in the unusual position of visiting a murder suspect in custody. Inspector Slack had reluctantly agreed to the visit, recognizing that Miss Marple's unique understanding of human nature might elicit additional details that could prove relevant to the prosecution. The meeting took place in a small interview room at the police station, with Constable Polk stationed discreetly by the door. Miss Hartley appeared to have aged years overnight. The fierce determination that had sustained her through her confession had given way to a profound exhaustion. Yet when she saw Miss Marple, something flickered in her eyes, perhaps relief at seeing a face that held compassion rather than judgment. "I've brought your music," Miss Marple said gently, placing a leather folder on the table between them. "The vicar thought you might want it. There are also some personal items from your cottage, photographs, your mother's prayer book." Miss Hartley's fingers traced the worn leather of the prayer book. Mother died, believing her money would restore the organ. £3,000, she saved it over 40 years of taking in sewing and mending, every penny earned by her own hands, set aside for God's music. "Tell me about her," Miss Marple encouraged. "She must have been remarkable to inspire such devotion." For the first time since her arrest, Miss Hartley smiled. She was tone deaf, couldn't carry a tune if her life depended on it. But she sat in the same pew every Sunday for 60 years, listening to Father play, then to me. She said the organ's voice was how angels must sound, pure and powerful and infinitely beautiful. When did she make her bequest? 5 years ago, when the cancer was diagnosed. She knew she didn't have long and she wanted to leave something meaningful behind. She made me promise to use the money for the organ and nothing else. "Music is your gift, Caroline," she said, "but the organ is your calling. See that it continues to sing when we're both gone." Miss Marple observed how Miss Hartley's hands trembled as she spoke of her mother. "That must have made Whitfield's theft particularly painful, knowing your mother's sacrifice had been perverted. You understand, don't you?" Miss Hartley looked directly at her. "It wasn't just money he stole. It was my mother's legacy, my father's tradition, 3 centuries of worship. He turned something sacred into chips on a gambling table." There was a knock at the door, and Inspector Slack entered with a thick folder. "Miss Hartley, we've been investigating Whitfield's gambling activities. It appears your mother's bequest was lost at the horse races in a single afternoon. He placed it all on a supposed sure thing that came in last." The colour drained from Miss Hartley's face. "All of it? In one day?" "I'm afraid so. The bookmakers. Records are quite clear. £3,000 on a horse called Heaven's Chorus, of all things." Miss Hartley laughed, a bitter sound that held no mirth. "Heaven's Chorus?" Mother would have appreciated the irony. Her money meant for Heaven's music, lost on a horse with that name. Miss Marple had been studying the financial records Slack had brought. "Inspector, there's something here that puzzles me. According to these records, Whitfield's gambling intensified dramatically 3 years ago, precisely when the organ fund was established. Before that, his betting was relatively modest." Slack examined the papers. "You're right. It's as if having access to the fund triggered something in him. The amounts increased steadily and he began taking greater risks." "The temptation of available money," Miss Marple observed. "Sometimes having access to funds not our own can awaken desires we didn't know we harboured." Miss Hartley had been silent during this exchange, but now spoke with renewed energy. 3 years ago, Whitfield's wife was still alive. She managed their household finances with an iron hand. When she died, he was suddenly free to indulge his vices, and the organ fund provided the means. "You knew his wife well," Miss Marple prompted. "Margaret Whitfield was a good woman, strict but fair. She would have been horrified by what Gerald became after her death. I helped nurse her through her final illness, spending hours at their cottage. She made me promise to keep an eye on Gerald, said he was weak when it came to money." "Yet you gave him the key to your mother's bequest," Slack pointed out. "I trusted him," Miss Hartley replied simply. "He was the church treasurer, had been for 17 years before Margaret died. His reputation was spotless. How could I have known that Margaret was the one maintaining that reputation?" Miss Marple leaned forward. "When exactly did you begin to suspect something was wrong?" "About a year ago. The excuses for delays became increasingly elaborate. Then I noticed he'd started avoiding me after church services. When I asked direct questions about the restoration timeline, he would defer to the next committee meeting. But it was when Mr. Morrison from the bank mentioned seeing Whitfield at Newmarket races that I truly began to worry." "Why didn't you act then?" Slack asked. "What could I do? Suspicion isn't proof. I started documenting everything. keeping notes of his excuses, tracking the supposed progress that never materialized. I even hired a private investigator with my own savings, but Whitfield had covered his tracks well. The false invoices looked legitimate. The companies he invented had addresses and registration numbers. It was only when I demanded to contact these companies directly that his fabrication began to unravel. Miss Marple had found something else in the records. This is interesting. There's a notation here that Whitfield attempted to borrow against the church's fire insurance policy just 2 weeks ago. The application was denied. He was desperate, Slack concluded. His gambling debts were mounting and he'd exhausted the organ fund. He must have known discovery was imminent. I told him I was going to the bishop, Miss Hartley said. The Sunday before he died, I confronted him after evening service. Told him I had evidence of the false invoices and would present it to the church authorities that week. He laughed at first, then grew angry, said I was a meddling old woman who should stick to playing hymns. But I saw fear in his eyes. So he knew his exposure was imminent when he died, Miss Marple mused. I wonder if he had any inkling of the danger he was in. Miss Hartley's expression hardened. He thought he was untouchable. 20 years as treasurer, pillar of the community, respected by all. He believed his reputation would protect him, that people would believe him over a spinster organist. He didn't understand that some betrayals demand a reckoning beyond what human justice provides. The room fell silent as the weight of her words settled over them. Here was a woman who had chosen divine retribution over earthly justice, who had appointed herself judge, jury, and executioner in the case of Gerald Whitfield's crimes against the sacred. Chapter 8. Chemistry books and candle supplies. The evidence room at the police station had been transformed into a makeshift laboratory, where Inspector Robinson, the fire investigation expert, was conducting detailed analyses of the materials found in Miss Hartley's workshop. Miss Marple had been invited to observe, her insights having proven valuable throughout the investigation. The array of items spread across the examination table told a story of meticulous planning and patient preparation. Remarkable, Robinson muttered, examining a half-completed Advent candle under a magnifying glass. The craftsmanship is exceptional. If I didn't know what to look for, I'd never suspect these weren't ordinary candles. The hollowing is virtually invisible, and the resealing is perfect. Inspector Slack studied the chemistry texts that had belonged to Miss Hartley's father. These books date from the 1920s and 30s. Her father made extensive notes about various chemical compounds and their properties. Look here, an entire section on phosphorus compounds with detailed safety warnings. Miss Marple picked up one of the completed candles, noting its weight and balance. She must have practiced extensively to achieve such precision. This represents weeks, perhaps months of preparation. We found receipt records, Constable Polk reported, entering with a ledger. Miss Hartley purchased candle-making supplies from craft shops in 3 different villages over the past 2 months. Small amounts each time, nothing that would raise suspicion. Robinson had moved on to analysing the chemical residues found on the workbench. The phosphorus extraction method is old-fashioned but effective. She used rat. Poison that's been banned for decades must have found old stock in her father's supplies. The extraction process would have been dangerous, requiring careful handling and precise temperature control. A woman of 70 handling such dangerous chemicals, Slack shook his head. The determination required is staggering. Miss Marple examined a notebook found among the supplies, filled with Miss Hartley's neat handwriting. She documented everything, each attempt, each failure, each refinement of the process. This entry from 3 weeks ago, successful test with timed ignition, 32 minutes from lighting to phosphorus contact, perfect for evening service alibi. Dr. Haydock arrived with additional findings from his medical examination of Whitfield's remains. I found something interesting. There were trace amounts of a sedative in Whitfield's system, not enough to incapacitate him, but sufficient to slow his reactions. He would have been drowsy when the fire started, less likely to escape quickly. How would she have administered it? Slack asked. Miss Marple recalled something from her earlier observations. The church provides sherry after morning service for the choir and church officers. Miss Hartley often served it. It would have been simple to add a mild sedative to Whitfield's glass. Premeditation at every level, Robinson observed. She wanted him conscious enough to know what was happening, but impaired enough to prevent escape. They were interrupted by the arrival of Mrs. Bantry, who had been gathering information from the village gossips. "Jane, Inspector, you'll want to hear this. I've learned that Miss Hartley made several trips to London in recent weeks, supposedly to visit music shops. But Mrs. Pemberton's niece saw her at the British Library, in the science reading room. Research, Miss Marple concluded. She was verifying her father's notes, ensuring her method would work. Slack was examining the financial records again. She spent nearly £500 of her own savings on this murder plot, materials, travel, research. That's a significant sum for someone living on a church organist's pension. She mentioned that she had been saving for a trip to Leipzig, Miss Marple recalled, to visit Bach's church and play the organs there. It was her retirement dream. She spent her retirement fund on revenge instead. Robinson had discovered something else significant. These candle moulds, they're antiques, probably from the Victorian era. High quality, designed for making church candles specifically. They would have been expensive even when new. They were her mother's, Miss Marple realised, remembering something she'd seen in Miss Hartley's cottage. Her mother made candles for the church as part of her service. Miss Hartley used her mother's own tools to create the weapons that killed the man who stole her mother's bequest. The symbolism was not lost on anyone present. Every aspect of the murder had been imbued with meaning, from the Advent wreath itself to the tools used in its creation. "There's something else," Polk announced, returning with another evidence box. "We found correspondence in Miss Hartley's cottage, letters to various authorities about the embezzlement, all returned with polite deferrals or requests for more evidence. She tried to get justice through proper channels for over a year." Miss Marple read through the letters, noting the increasing desperation in Miss Hartley's tone. She wrote to the bishop, the church commissioners, the charity commission, even their member of parliament. Everyone acknowledged her concerns, but no one acted. "The system failed her," Dr. Haydock observed quietly. "The system failed everyone," Miss Marple corrected. "It failed to protect the fund, failed to stop Whitfield's theft, and ultimately failed to prevent Miss Hartley from becoming a murderer." Inspector Slack had been compiling a timeline from all the evidence. She began planning this at least 2 months ago, shortly after learning the organ was beyond repair. The discovery that restoration was impossible even with funds seems to have been the trigger. "The point of no return," Miss Marple agreed. "When hope died, revenge was born." Robinson held up one of the Advent candles to the light. "The purple dye she used is interesting. It's made from crushed berries and flowers, completely natural. She could have used commercial dye, but she chose to make her own." "Purple for penance," Miss Marple observed. "Advent purple represents preparation and penitence. She was preparing her own penance while planning Whitfield's punishment." The evidence painted a picture of a woman who had approached murder with the same devotion and attention to detail she had brought to her music. Every element had been carefully considered, practiced, and perfected. It was, in its own terrible way, a masterpiece of planning and execution. "One thing puzzles me," Slack said finally. "Why didn't she destroy the evidence after the murder? She must have known we'd search her cottage." Miss Marple understood. "Because she was proud of it, Inspector. This was her last and greatest work, her final composition. She wanted someone to understand the full extent of what she had done and why. The evidence was her confession, written in wax and phosphorus instead of words." Chapter 9. The workshop where faith met chemistry. The workshop behind Miss Hartley's cottage had once been her father's dispensary, a place where he had prepared medicines for the village before his retirement to become the church organist. Miss Marple stood in the doorway, observing as Inspector Slack and his team documented the space that had been transformed from a place of healing into a laboratory of death. The room retained its original fixtures, glass-fronted cabinets filled with brown bottles bearing Latin labels, a marble mortar and pestle on the wooden counter, scales that could measure to the grain. But alongside these relics of pharmaceutical history were the newer additions, the candle moulds, the blocks of pure white wax, the careful notes documenting each stage of Miss Hartley's deadly preparations. "It's like stepping back in time," Dr. Haydock observed, examining the old medicine bottles. Some of these preparations haven't been used in 40 years. Mercury compounds, arsenic solutions, phosphorus preparations, everything from the old pharmacopoeia, when poison was considered medicine in the right doses. Miss Marple noticed a photograph on the wall, showing a younger Miss Hartley standing beside her father in this very room. Both were smiling, and she held a certificate, presumably her qualification as a dispensing assistant. She trained under her father, Miss Marple noted. She would have understood the properties of all these substances. Inspector Slack was studying a workbench near the window, where natural light would have been best for detailed work. She set up an entire production line here. Look at the progression. Hollow the candle, prepare the phosphorus mixture, insert it precisely, reseal with matching wax, add the purple dye, each step documented and refined. On a shelf above the bench sat 3 completed Advent wreaths, identical to the one that had killed Whitfield. She made spares, Slack observed grimly, in case the first attempt failed. Or, in case there were other targets, Robinson suggested, entering with his analysis kit. We should check if anyone else involved with the church finances was at risk. Miss Marple had found a leather journal hidden behind the chemistry texts. Opening it revealed not murder plans, but musical compositions, original hymn arrangements dated over many years. The most recent entries, however, were different, mathematical calculations interposed with musical notations, as if she had been composing a different kind of score entirely. She was calculating burning rates, Miss Marple explained, showing the journal to the others. See how she used musical timing, minutes and beats, to work out how long each candle would burn before reaching the phosphorus. She approached murder like a musical composition, with precise timing and calculated crescendos. Dr. Haydock had discovered something troubling in one of the old medicine cabinets. There's enough poison here to kill half the village. Strychnine, cyanide compounds, various alkaloids, all properly labelled and stored, but lethal nonetheless. Her father's legacy, Miss Marple observed, preserved like a museum, until she found a modern use for ancient knowledge. The team continued their documentation, photographing every detail of the workshop. In one corner stood an old harmonium, similar to the one in the church but in worse condition. Sheet music was scattered across it, hymns marked with frustrated annotations about the instrument's limitations. She practiced here, Miss Marple realised, when she couldn't bear to play the church's inadequate instrument anymore. She came here to her father's workshop and played this broken harmonium while planning her revenge. Inspector Slack had found financial records in a desk drawer. She kept meticulous accounts of every penny spent on the murder. Materials, travel, research costs, all documented as carefully as her father's pharmaceutical records. She even calculated the cost per candle, £2, 4 shillings and 6pence, including labour time. She valued her time, Robinson observed. Even in planning murder, she maintained professional standards. A knock at the workshop door interrupted their investigation. Reverend Clement stood outside, his face drawn with exhaustion and sorrow. "Inspector, Miss Marple, I've come from visiting Miss Hartley. She's asked me to give you this." He handed over a sealed envelope addressed to Miss Marple in Miss Hartley's precise handwriting. Inside was a single sheet of music paper with a few bars of notation and words beneath. The music of the spheres falls silent. When commerce corrupts the sacred. My father would understand. Perhaps you will too. C.H. It's from Bach's Christmas Oratorio, the vicar explained, looking at the notation. The section about the shepherds watching their flocks, keeping vigil against the darkness. She played it every Advent for 40 years. Miss Marple studied the message, understanding its layered meaning. Miss Hartley saw herself as a guardian who had failed in her vigil, allowing the wolf of greed to destroy what she was meant to protect. The murder was both her failure and her twisted attempt at redemption. There's something else, Clement continued reluctantly. The bishop has decided that when this is over, the insurance money from Whitfield's death, since he died, intestate with no close relatives, will go to the church, specifically to purchase a new organ. The irony was staggering. Miss Hartley's crime would ultimately achieve what her patients could not, the replacement of the organ. But it would be a new instrument, not the historic one she had loved. and she would never play it. "She must have known," Inspector Slack said slowly. "She's too intelligent not to have foreseen this outcome." Miss Marple nodded. She knew, but by then it wasn't about saving the organ anymore. It was about punishing the man who had destroyed it. Revenge had replaced restoration as her purpose. They found more evidence of her planning, receipts for books on forensic science, notes on how fires were investigated, research on establishing alibis. She had anticipated every aspect of the investigation, planned for every contingency except one, the possibility that she might not care about being caught. "Look at this," Dr. Haydock called from examining another cabinet. She had prepared a second batch of phosphorus mixture, enough for several more candles. The date on the container is from last week, after Whitfield was already dead. The implications were chilling. Had Miss Hartley planned other murders? Or was this simply the methodical completion of a task, finishing what she had started even after its purpose was fulfilled? Miss Marple noticed something else, a small leather case hidden behind the harmonium. Inside were concert programs from London, Leipzig, Vienna, all the great musical capitals Miss Hartley had dreamed of visiting. Each program was carefully annotated with notes about the organs, the acoustics, the pieces performed. Dreams documented but never realized. Sacrificed first to duty, then to revenge. "This workshop," Miss Marple said finally, "is where faith met chemistry, where devotion transformed into destruction." She used her father's knowledge and her mother's tools to create something neither would have recognized as their legacy. The saddest part is that she knew exactly what she was doing, understood the full weight of her actions, and chose them anyway. Chapter 10. Light breaking through penitential purple. The trial of Miss Caroline Hartley had concluded just before Advent the following year, a full 12 months after Gerald Whitfield's death. Miss Marple sat in the gallery of the Crown Court as the verdict was delivered, guilty of murder, with a recommendation for mercy based on the extraordinary circumstances. The judge, in his summation, had spoken of a tragedy that encompassed both victim and perpetrator, a corruption of sacred trust that had led to an even greater corruption of the soul. Miss Hartley had stood perfectly straight as the sentence was pronounced. Life imprisonment with the possibility of parole after 15 years, given her age and previously unblemished character. She had looked up at the gallery just once, her eyes meeting Miss Marple's, and nodded slightly as if acknowledging the justice of her fate. Now, on this third Sunday of Advent, exactly 1 year after the murder, Miss Marple sat in St. Mary Mead's church as the new organ was officially dedicated. It was a fine instrument, German-made with clear tones that rang through the ancient stones with unprecedented clarity. The insurance money from Whitfield's death, combined with the recovered funds from his embezzlement and additional donations from a community shocked into generosity by the tragedy, had paid for an instrument that exceeded even the original organ's capabilities. The visiting organist, brought in from Canterbury Cathedral for the dedication, played Bach's Advent chorales with technical perfection. Yet Miss Marple could not help but think that the music, for all its beauty, lacked something that Miss Hartley's playing had possessed, a personal connection to each note, a sense that the music was not performed, but lived. Reverend Clement conducted the dedication service with appropriate solemnity, though his voice occasionally trembled when speaking of the church's musical heritage. He made no mention of recent events, focusing instead on renewal and redemption, on light breaking, through darkness. The Advent wreath on the altar bore 4 candles, 3 purple and 1 pink, just as it always had, as if nothing had changed. After the service, Miss Marple joined Inspector Slack, now retired, who had come for the dedication out of what he called professional curiosity. They stood together, listening to the congregation's mix of admiration for the new organ and carefully unspoken memories of why it had been needed. "I visited her last week," Slack said quietly. "Miss Hartley, I mean. She's teaching music to other inmates, has started a prison choir. The warden says she's a model prisoner." Miss Marple was not surprised. She would be. Order and discipline were always her nature. "I imagine she finds a certain peace in the routine of prison life, a penance that matches her crime." Dr. Haydock joined them, looking older than he had a year ago. The events had aged them all, confronting them with the depths to which desperation could drive even the most respectable people. "I've been thinking," he said, "about what drives someone to such extremity. The betrayal of trust, the destruction of something sacred, the failure of justice to provide remedy. Would any of us have done differently in her place?" "We would like to think so," Miss Marple replied. "But until we are tested, we cannot know what darkness we might be capable of." Miss Hartley discovered her capacity for darkness only when everything she valued was destroyed. Mrs. Bantry approached with news from the Restoration Committee, reformed after the tragedy. "We've voted to establish a memorial fund in Miss Hartley's mother's name. Her original bequest will be remembered, even if the circumstances... well, we feel something positive should come from all this sadness." The new organist began playing again, a triumphant voluntary that filled the church with sound. It was magnificent, technically perfect, everything a great organ should produce. Yet Miss Marple remembered the wheezing harmonium that Miss Hartley had coaxed into beauty through sheer force of will and love. Sometimes, she thought, the imperfect played with passion surpassed the perfect played with mere skill. Inspector Slack pulled out a letter. "She asked me to give you this, Miss Marple. Said to wait until today, the anniversary." Miss Marple opened the envelope carefully. Inside was a single sheet of prison notepaper, covered with Miss Hartley's still precise handwriting. "Dear Miss Marple, by the time you read this, the new organ will be singing in St. Mary Mead. I hope it is everything the parish deserves, a voice worthy of 3 centuries of worship. I regret that my actions have stained that heritage, but I do not regret that Gerald Whitfield faced judgment for his crimes." You understood, I think, why I used the Advent wreath. Advent is about waiting for light to enter darkness. I waited too long, until my own darkness overwhelmed the light I was meant to serve. The pink candle of Gaudete Sunday represents joy breaking through penance. I chose it for Gerald's death because I wanted him to know, in his last moments, that his theft had been discovered, that the joy he had stolen would be his destruction. I am at peace now. Prison is its own kind of Advent, a long waiting in darkness for a light that may never come. But I have music still, in my head if not at my fingers, and I teach others to find their own music. Perhaps that is redemption enough. The organ is dead. Long live the organ. Yours in truth, Caroline Hartley." Miss Marple folded the letter carefully and placed it in her handbag. Around her the congregation was departing, full of praise for the new organ and carefully avoiding mention of why it had been needed. The Advent season would continue, candles would be lit, carols would be sung, and life would go on as it always had in St. Mary Mead. But Miss Marple knew that some in the village would never see an Advent wreath again without remembering the year when sacred candles became weapons, when patience transformed into vengeance, when the pink candle of joy brought not light but consuming fire. She thought of Miss Hartley in her prison cell, teaching music to women who had never known beauty, and wondered if perhaps there was redemption to be found even in the darkest places. As she walked home through the December afternoon, Connor's voice from Velvet Clues would close our tale. And so ends our story of the Advent Wreath Arsonist, a reminder that the most dangerous fires are often those that burn slowly within the human heart, fed by betrayal and the failure of justice. Miss Marple understood that Caroline Hartley had lit 2 fires that Advent night, one that consumed Gerald Whitfield's body, and another that would burn in the village's memory forever. Sometimes, dear listeners, the greatest mysteries are not who committed the crime, but what drives ordinary people to extraordinary darkness. Until next time, this is Connor, asking you to consider, what would it take to transform your patience into peril, your devotion into destruction? May you never need to find out.